In the remote sands of northern Burkina Faso, beneath a rising sun that cast no warmth, the military outpost of Dargo lay still. It was a ghost of a base half forgotten, half defiant, propped up on rusted metal and the thinnest threads of loyalty. Here, far from the capital, far from the speeches of Captain Ibrahim, 50 young men stood watch over a country slipping deeper into darkness. They weren't generals. They weren't politicians. They were farmers turned fighters, sons turned soldiers. Men like Corporal Issa Kawanda, who had once studied engineering before the war came to his village. He now gripped an old rifle, patched together with black tape, and watched the horizon like a man counting heartbeats. For months they had heard the name JNIM, Jamaat Nasir, Al-Islam wal Muslimin. No uniforms, no flags, just fire, just death. They didn't fight for land. They fought to erase the very idea of a nation. And yet, despite the warnings, Dargo had grown quiet again. Too quiet, or forgotten. One soldier muttered that morning, sipping bitter coffee as the dry wind swept across the base. Even speaks to Ouagadougou now, not us. But silence in this part of Burkina Faso was rarely a blessing. It was a prelude. At exactly 5:48 a.m. it began. The first explosion tore through the northern gate like a scream. Then came the barrage mortar, bullets, firebombs hurled by shadows moving fast between thorn trees and sand. Over 100 fighters swarmed the base, coordinated and ruthless. There was no warning, no mercy. They moved like they had rehearsed it 100 times, Issa recalled. They weren't attacking, they were erasing. In minutes, the communications tower crumbled. The radio operator, barely 20, was shot before he could send a signal. Reinforcements would never come. Gunfire echoed off the steel walls. Some soldiers tried to regroup. Others ran for the perimeter, only to be caught in crossfire. One truck exploded with a roar that sent shockwaves through the barracks. Smoke mixed with dust. Sand turned black with blood. In the chaos, Issa found cover behind a wall of sandbags. He watched a fellow soldier try to drag a wounded man across open ground. A bullet hit him mid-sprint. He didn't scream, just dropped. The attackers moved through the base with brutal efficiency. Ammunition crates were looted, weapons stripped, tents torched. Then came the worst part. They began burning bodies. Whether it was ritual or rage, no one knew. But the fire rose high enough to be seen by nearby villages. Even the animals fled. By 7 a.m., it was over. 50 men. Gone. No official announcement came that day. No press conference. No words from Captain. The government remained silent, perhaps in shock, perhaps in shame. But in the northern winds of Balsa province, the people knew their protectors were dead. The shadows were still moving. The sun rose higher over Dargo, revealing a landscape of ash and ruin. Smoke lingered like a curse over the burned-out base, the scent of gunpowder mixing with something far worse loss. 50 soldiers lay dead. 50 uniforms, 50 lives, 50 promises unkept. But in Ouagadougou, the capital, the silence was deafening. There was no televised statement from Captain Ibrahim, no mention of the fallen sons, no wreaths, no flags at half-mast. For the families waiting on phone calls that would never come, grief turned quickly into fury. He promised us protection, one mother whispered to a local journalist who dared to ask. He promised a new Burkina Faso, but my boy died alone. Inside the presidential compound, where red berets moved through polished corridors and radio briefings flickered with alerts, the news had arrived swiftly. Intelligence officers confirmed the death toll. Over 50 soldiers, nearly a dozen wounded. Base destroyed, equipment stolen, clear and humiliating blow. Worse, the enemy wasn't new. Jamaat Nasir, Al-Islam, had been haunting northern Burkina Faso for years. They were ghosts with guns, spreading fear like wildfire across Mali, Niger, and now deeper, into S territory. He had declared war on them more than once. It promised victory in fiery speeches and revolutionary slogans. But now the nation saw the truth, was not winning. The captain who had once electrified Africa with his anti-imperialist fire, who wore his red beret like Sankara reborn, was now facing his most dangerous foe, not jihadists, but the slow unraveling of belief. In the months before Dargo had tightened his grip on power, he had silenced dissenters. Journalists who criticized the regime were conscripted. Opposition figures were monitored or vanished quietly from public life. Social media was filled with praise for the captain, but it was hard to tell which voices were real and which were manufactured. Now, the narrative cracked. Rumors flooded the countryside. Some said the army had been warned of the attack but ignored it. Others claimed the base had been deliberately under-equipped because its soldiers had expressed discontent. Most chilling of all were whispers that no longer trusted his own officers, that paranoia had crept into command. In the north, fear took new form. The villagers around Dargo fled. They had seen what happened when Shmim came, how fighters would return weeks later, asking who had spoken to soldiers, who had collaborated, who had prayed for the wrong side. They had seen what happened to informants. Bodies left in ditches, eyes gouged out, throats slit open. "We are abandoned," one elder said. "Speaks of gold and glory in Ouagadougou, but we live in the dust with the dead." Still, the captain did not speak. His administration offered no explanation, no apology. Instead, state media pivoted. They posted videos of meeting with farmers, smiling with schoolchildren, walking tall through markets in his decorated uniform. The death of 50 men was treated not as a national tragedy, but as a footnote. Yet far from the capital, resentment grew. In Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso's military-ruled allies, some praised for standing firm, refusing to appear weak. Others, however, saw a man trapped in the very machinery he once vowed to dismantle. A man struggling to hold together a dream built on fire and fury. Inside the army, tension festered. Commanders questioned orders. Younger officers whispered in mess halls. If the president wouldn't even acknowledge a massacre, how long would loyalty hold? How long before another coup, another uniformed savior, stepped forward with a new promise? Had built his rise on the power of image, red beret, clenched fist, anti-colonial fire, but the enemy didn't care about image. They cared only about death, and death had just sent him a message. The red beret was starting to fade. The smoke had long cleared over Dargo, but the smell of it still lingered in the nation's conscience. In hushed voices and unspoken prayers, Burkina Faso began to mourn not just the lives lost, but the quiet death of an idea. Captain Ibrahim had once walked like a storm across the West African stage. Young, defiant, charismatic, he had promised to do what no leader before him could, to reclaim the nation from foreign claws, to crush the insurgency, to build something real for the people. His words soared, his image spread. To many, he was the face of a new Africa. But revolutions do not survive on fire alone. The massacre at Dargo was more than a military failure, it was a breach of faith. And that breach was beginning to spread like a crack through glass. Behind palace walls, inner circle debated in whispers. Some urged him to act, speak, acknowledge, mourn. Others warned him to stay the course, strongman, do not apologize. To admit weakness was to invite rebellion, not sympathy. Instead of eulogies, there were policy briefs. Instead of funerals, there were televised rallies. State-controlled news focused on agriculture gains and infrastructure programs. But the people knew. The silence was too loud to ignore. In the markets of Ouagadougou, in the mosques of Fada Nguma, in the mining towns once promised to return to the people, doubt had begun to settle in. It crept through the radio stations, the WhatsApp groups, the midnight talks between soldiers. If he cannot protect the army, one soldier said quietly, how will he protect the nation? The revolution had promised, soaked in the spirit of Thomas Sankara, was losing its rhythm. The Pan-African vision, the rejection of French imperialism. The alliance with Russia, all of it was beginning to look less like strategy and more like desperation. Across the ocean, Washington grew colder. France, long expelled, doubled down on its warnings about S trajectory. Moscow remained supportive of it, at least on the surface, but analysts whispered of deals struck in gold and silence. The West saw a man becoming a liability. Its people began to see a man losing control. And yet there was no coup. Not yet, because for all his faults, still held one thing that no general could steal. The memory of what he had once meant. To the young, to the angry, to the forgotten, he was still a symbol, a defiance, a pride, a nation that dared to say no. But symbols are fragile. They do not bleed, but they break. By June, Burkina Faso had become quieter. The streets of Ouagadougou were calm. Dissent had been muted. Investigative journalists had gone silent. Some had vanished. Human rights groups were denied access to the north. The press, once cautiously curious, now published headlines carefully filtered by state review. Once a man of the people, now walked with more guards, gave fewer interviews, and spoke mostly to cameras that already knew the script. His face still bore that confident half-smile, but the sparkle of something new had dimmed. He had become a ruler, and in Burkina Faso, rulers often become ghosts. In July, a small memorial was held in secret by the families of the Dargo dead. No flags, no generals, just candles. Names were whispered one by one: Nissa Kawanda, Abdul Fafana, Hamidou Diallo, and dozens more. The night was still, but the pain was loud. Somewhere in the crowd, an old man placed a photo of Thomas Sankara beside a torn poster. Of the gesture, said everything. This is who you said you would be. And far off in the northern dark, Jim remained unbroken, waiting. The question now was no longer if could lead the revolution. It was whether the revolution was already over.